Good morning, colleagues. My name is Lynn Horn. For those of you who don't know me, I head up the Office of Research Integrity. And welcome and thanks for joining this webinar. So the purpose of this webinar is to introduce to you just an overview of the just released ASSAf, the Academy of Sciences South Africa, draft Code of Conduct for the Protection of Personal Information Act for researchers. So the idea is that this Code of Conduct, once submitted to the regulator, will become binding on all researchers in South Africa, whether they're working in universities or other institutions, including in the private sector. So I'm going to hand over now. And just to say, we also have a short window to submit comments on the Code of Conduct. That will be, we have to submit them by the 14th of October. So at the end of the week of the webinar, I will give a little bit more information about that. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth de Stadler, who I think many of you know. She has been contracted by UCT to lead our POPIA project and has been working with us for the last, I think, almost 2 years, Elizabeth. Yeah. She's also has been the lead in the draft of this Code of Conduct on behalf of ASSAf. She wasn't initially, but they brought her in as she is recognized as an expert in this domain. So hand over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I start my presentation. For the most part, what I'm here for today is to answer any questions that you might have around the ASSAf Code of Conduct. As Lynn mentioned, this is a draft code. It is still going to be open for public submission, not just on this occasion as it is now, but also again when it goes before it goes to the information regulator. There will be other opportunities to make submissions. But I want to also answer any questions that you might have about the code or about the Protection of Personal Information Act in general. Maybe just a little bit by way of introduction about what is a code of conduct. So a POPI code of conduct is an instrument that a sector or an industry or a group of people that engage in similar activities can come together and draft a code of conduct in terms of the Protection of Personal Information Act. What it does is it translates the legislation into effectively a standard that, in this case, researchers must adhere to in order to comply with the legislation. Once a code is drafted, it goes through a very lengthy accreditation process. The first Code of Conduct was formally accredited just a couple of days ago, and that code spent about 2 or 3 years in development. It goes to the information regulator, which is the statutory body that was created to enforce the Protection of Personal Information Act. And what happens then is once the information regulator is happy with the Code of Conduct, it gets formally accredited and it gets the status of law. In other words, it becomes legally enforceable. You can think about it as almost an adaptation of POPI for research activities. Right. So what is incredibly important to understand is nothing, and this is where I'm kind of covering myself here, because as Lynn mentioned, I participated in the drafting of the code. There is nothing in the code that isn't already a requirement in terms of the Protection of Personal Information Act. For those of you who might not be aware, that act came in full force and effect last year. And so how you need to think about this is that these requirements that we're going to be discussing today are really just a specific expression of existing requirements that were already part and parcel of POPI compliance for more than a year now. Right, so I did not create these obligations, and for those of you who are going to feel frustrated, and I anticipate that it might be the majority of you, that frustration I completely understand, but it is a piece of legislation that we have to comply with, whether there is a code of conduct or not. Right, so that is a very important first misconception to get out of the way. Once the code gets accredited, it's not that we don't have to comply with POPI. The code just tells us how we have to comply with POPI, or the Protection of Personal Information Act. Okay, so my purpose today is to take you through and to head off some other misconceptions that we know just from experience exists about the code and exists about the Protection of Personal Information Act in the research context. But I'm also very, very interested in answering any questions that you might have. For that, you can use the question and answer functionality. I am going to talk through my presentation first. And then with the help of Veronica, we will answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. We have left quite a lot of room for questions and answers. We will also ensure that the questions that we don't answer get answered in a frequently asked questions document, which we will distribute via the Protection of Personal Information Act information team site, which we have created for that purpose. So please feel free to submit your questions. We will get to as many of them as possible. With that, I'm just going to share my screen very quickly and we can get going. Okay, so the good news that I do want to share with you is, and I mean this absolutely sincerely, for most of you, as I said, most of you are going to feel a little bit of frustration with the code. We have seen this in other sectors, and we have seen this with codes of conduct all over the place. But it is also extremely likely that the code is not as bad as you think it is. The reason for that is, or as onerous maybe is a better way of formulating it. The reason for that is that a lot of the things that you will be required to do are not new. And I don't mean that it's not new because POPI's been in force for a while. I mean, it's not new because it has always been a part of the ethical considerations that we need to take into account before we embark on research. Right. So a lot of the times, all these requirements are going to feel very familiar. And that is because many of them are already in place. Some of them overlap almost 100% with the existing regulations, for instance, around health research, etc. So for many of you, this will not represent a massive change to how you go about doing your research, as long as you have been adhering to the ethical standards that you are already subject to when conducting research with human participants. Right, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that everybody understands when the code applies. This is a bit of a reminder. For some of you, this will be old news because you attended maybe our previous information sessions about the application of POPI to research activities. But I'm going to revisit them just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And for many of you, it might mean that the rest of this presentation is not that relevant because perhaps you don't engage in the type of research that will be covered by the code. So I'm going to focus on scope. So when is it that the Protection of Personal Information Act and therefore the ASSAf Code of Conduct will apply? So this is a quote from the scope statement of the code. So the code applies to the processing of personal information of identifiable research participants, which could be individuals or organizations, for research in South Africa. Processing includes the collection, use, sharing, transformation, storage, or preservation of personal information of research participants. Okay, so complicated statement. There's a lot of information hiding in there. And the code goes on to explain a lot of these concepts in quite a bit of detail in order to assist researchers to understand which research activities will be subject to the code. So the first concept that we have to unpack is what is personal information? And I'm going to discuss that next. I'm also going to discuss what is meant by processing, and we're going to look a little bit at what is considered identifiable. So those three concepts are pivotal to understanding when the code will apply. So the code will not apply to all. It will apply to information that involves the processing of identifiable personal information, and I'm going to repeat that a lot. Right, so first off, really important to understand concept of personal information. It includes anything from identifiers, and identifiers might be anything from an ID number through to an employment number or student number, or perhaps you assign specific numbers to research participants. Those identifiers, those codes and things I can use in order to identify the research participant is considered themselves personal information. It includes demographic information, contact details, financial information, background or historical information, biometric information, which can include obviously genetic information because it can be used. Biometrics is defined as any information that through the application of technology can be used to identify a person, and is ordinarily comprised of various physical or psychological attributes that can identify a person. So the obvious examples there would be your fingerprint, your DNA, a map of your face. All of those types of information can, through the application of various technologies, be used to identify a person. It includes health information. It includes information about preferences and opinions. So if we are doing, for instance, research relating to statements that people made on the internet or on social media, it includes behavioral information. So when we observe people's behavior, whether it's online or physical behavior that we are observing, all of that is considered personal information, and that the Act and therefore the code will apply to that information as long as it is identifiable. So I'm going to talk about what identifiable means in a second. What is incredibly important, and I'm going to repeat this a couple of times as well, is the code will apply to information even if that information is already available in the public domain, right? The Protection of Personal Information Act also applies to information that has already been made public or is in the public domain, right? So as long as that information is relatable to an identifiable living research participant, which could be a person or an organization, POPI and the code will apply. So saying that my research only involves information that I got out of public records, or information that I got out of a repository, or information that I got from the internet, does not mean that the code doesn't apply. The code very much applies. So that is a very important sort of myth that I want to dispel. The code applies even though that information might already be publicly available. Then there's a subset of personal information which is called special personal information. This is relevant to the question of whether you need a POPI consent in order to do your research. And we will talk about consent a little bit more. It's not always required, but when you are using special personal information, slightly different rules might apply. So if your research involves personal information relating to religious or philosophical beliefs, the person's research participant's race or ethnic origin, trade union membership, health information, information relating to a person's sex life, biometric information, or information relating to criminal behavior, this is just something to flag, because that will determine some of the rules that apply to you down the line, which we will get to. So personal information as wide as you can imagine, special personal information are these specific things. The code will apply even if this information is already available in a public domain. So what is identified or identifiable? Code will apply to any information that identifies a research participant. So that might be something like an ID number. It might be something like an email address. So like your email address is at UCT renders you identifiable. I know who that email address belongs to. It will include information such as your name. So any information that on the face of it identifies the research participant. If there's information like that in your data set, the code will apply. It also applies if there's information in your data set that can be manipulated to identify a research participant. So now we're dealing with identifiable information. The information might be masked, but someone, you included, with someone can re-identify that information. That is often referred to as pseudonymization. And sometimes that information can be rendered identifiable because there is a method through which the information can be linked with other information. So that's often when we create pseudonyms. What this means is that the code might apply even if your information has been pseudonymized. So it has been anonymized to a degree, unless that anonymization is completely permanent and irreversible. You can't reverse it. What the code employs in order to test whether information is identifiable is a test that is used often in data privacy, which is called the motivated intruder test. So you have to consider whether identification is reasonably likely to be attempted, whether a person would have a motive to do it, how successful any attempt may be for a person who is reasonably motivated to do it, right? So for those of you who do research on partially anonymized information, you will still be subject to the code. And if you believe that your information is fully anonymized, you should use the motivated intruder test, which there is an annexure to the code that explains how to apply that test in order to figure out whether your information is likely to be capable of re-identification, and if it is, the code will still apply to you. Almost between us, for what I do in practice, and that is perhaps because I don't really mind if the code applies. If there's any doubt as to whether the information is capable of re-identification, I just assume that the code does apply and would comply with the code in any event. So when in doubt, towards the side of caution and just assume that the code applies. And hopefully by the end of today's session, that will no longer be that alarming to you to think that the code might apply. So here's a little bit of additional information about the motivated intruder. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I do want to leave enough time for us to get to your questions. It is always, and this is why I created this slide, it is always a good idea to partially anonymize or pseudonymize the information that you use. So if it is possible for you to at least mask the identity of your research participants, let's say by assigning them a number and keeping their names out of the data set, that is a very, very strong safeguard. The code will still apply, but you would have in one fell swoop taken care of the vast majority of obligations that are imposed by you on by the code. So please always consider at least partially anonymizing your research data. It is a very, very strong security safeguard. All right, so what is processing? Now that we've dealt with what is personal information and what is what identifiable or identified means, the code has got provisions that will apply from the minute you start planning your research through to when you start creating, collecting, using, sharing, transforming, storing, destroying, and eventually finishing your research. The code applies to that entire, I almost want to call it the research life cycle, right? So if we look at the research life cycle, and again, this is where things should start to feel slightly familiar. There are aspects of POPI and the code that will impact how we plan and design our research, how we collect and capture raw research data, how we collaborate, how we analyze research data, how we manage, store, and preserve the data, how we publish it, how we discover, reuse, and cite information. Obviously, towards that last part of the research life cycle, sharing, publishing, discovering, reusing, and citation, very often the information is already completely anonymized, by which I mean there is no earthly way in which anybody, motivated or not, could identify the research participant, but there are aspects of this code that will apply up until that point when the research data becomes completely anonymized, right? So the entire life cycle of research will be affected, but as will become clear during the course of the presentation, a lot of the work has to be done during the planning and design phase. So a lot of your work in complying with the code gets done when you are planning and designing your research protocol. Okay. So I want to correct some misconceptions. I promised to do this during the session today. So first, important to understand that POPI will apply to any research where there is human participation. It's both when there are human research participants or where there are research participants that are organizations. It could also apply to certain studies where, for instance, you are using organisms or animals, where those animals have owners or custodians, and you have to collect information about that owner or custodian. So you need to take a very broad definition of participation. The minute your research requires the collection of identified or identifiable personal information of a living individual or an existing organization, the code will apply. There has been the assumption that it only applies to scientific research or research in the health sciences. This is not correct. The minute there is research, there is participation by individuals or organizations that volunteer their personal information for your research, the code will apply. We have actually in the past at other institutions found that the health sciences are already compliant with the code because they comply with the National Health Act and the National Health REC guidelines, and those are largely consistent with the code of conduct. But in institutions where the so-called sort of scientific interpretation of research isn't applied in, for instance, the social sciences, there is quite a lot of work to be done if the social sciences are not currently at your institution adhering to the NHREC's guidelines on ethical research. So the code will apply the minute there is participation by either humans or organizations and personal information is being collected. POPI also applies to personal information that was collected from public records. This would include the internet, social media platforms, records administrated by public bodies. If you are collecting personal information, it does not matter if you're collecting it from an open source, if that information is identifiable, POPI, and therefore the code will apply. We also found that quite a few researchers believe that they are personally liable if something goes wrong. So if you are non-compliant with the code and with the Protection of Personal Information Act, there are a couple of sanctions. First off, there might be an investigation by the information regulator, and that might result in an enforcement notice, which might tell you to stop your research or to do your research differently. If you ignore an enforcement notice, you may be fined. If there is a data breach which causes harm to research participants and that harm is quantifiable, there might be civil actions or class actions. For the most part, if you are employed by the university, and a good test for that is, does the university deduct PAYE from your paycheck every month, then you are probably not personally liable. If you are not employed by the university, but you are subject to a contract, and that contract binds you to the policies of the university, in other words, the university does prescribe how you conduct your research, you must follow the research-related policies, you are also probably not personally liable. The institution is then liable for POPI compliance because the institution tells you what policies you must follow, etc. So if you are a completely independent researcher, again, your contractual arrangements with the institution as well as your funders will determine who is directly liable for POPI compliance, right? So that is an important point, and it's very important that you seek clarity if you are uncertain as to your status. And then lastly, POPI does not always require consent to use personal information for research purposes. You need to, when you listen to me today, when you review the code, you need to keep this separate from so-called informed consent, which is often an ethical requirement or a requirement in terms of the National Health Act. Right? So when I refer to consent today, I'm talking about POPI consent. It might be that you find yourself, depending on the type of research that you do, needing ethical consent, so informed consent, but not POPI consent. There might be other justifications in play. It's very unlikely that you would ever need POPI consent, but not informed consent. So those two things often serve the same purpose. When you get informed consent for ethical purposes, it's very likely that that consent, because it is informed, that it already complies with POPI and authorizes you to use personal information of those research participants. But we'll revisit this point. Right. So now we're going to give just a quick overview, like a bird's eye view of the code, and then I'm going to address just certain of the more complex areas again. So this is a sort of one picture that gives you an idea of everything that is in the code. So the first point we already addressed is, does the code apply to the specific research activity? The application of the code is assessed per research activity, not per institution. So I can't say the POPI code of conduct applies to all research done at UCT or applies to UCT. I can only gauge whether it applies on a project by project basis. Sometimes it will apply, sometimes it won't apply. It depends on whether you are processing identifiable personal information. The first step is to document the purpose of your research. You are already doing that, right? So because research using human participants, which would probably make up about 90% of the research that we're talking about today, goes through ethics approval, there is already a documented research protocol, and that is where you would document the purpose of your research already, right? So this is not, I think, an additional requirement. Then what the code requires is that you perform a preliminary risk assessment. It is a set of, if I'm not mistaken, 10 questions. They're all yes, no questions. And if your research, you answer yes to more than 5 of them, your research is considered high risk for purpose of the code. And what that means is that your protocol needs to be signed off by the Deputy Information Officer of the university or of a person designated by the Deputy Information Officer. Now, before you ask me who is that person or persons who will be designated by the Deputy Information Officer, we don't know that yet. This is a question, now that the code is out for public comment, that UCT will start planning and answering what that process is likely to look like for high risk research, or high impact research is perhaps a better way of putting it. Then you need to assess who is accountable. So that's what we were just talking about. Is it, and there the crucial question is it just research that is being done without any outside collaboration, either through funding or collaboration between research institutions or collaboration between researchers at the university and researchers at other institutions? We need to ensure that we understand who is accountable for the research, and that needs to be recorded in a contract. Again, this is something that I anticipate is already being done, but the code will also require it. So if there's any uncertainty as to who's accountable for compliance with the code, and sometimes there will be joint accountability, this needs to be spelled out in a contract. Then the next question is the processing of personal information, in this case, necessary and proportional? So this is where we guard against over collection or over processing of personal information. And there is a test for necessity and proportionality. One of the key tenets of POPI and therefore the code is less is more. So you need to process the least amount of personal information that you can in order to achieve the purpose of your research or of any future research that you might think will come from this data set. So you can cater for future research and therefore collect more personal information, but it needs to be a very conscious process. You need to be able to show that you considered whether you really need all of this personal information to achieve that purpose. Again, something that is already part of an inquiry into whether the research is ethical is to look at the extent to which we are invading a research participant's privacy and whether that is necessary. It is an assessment that you already ought to be doing whenever there are human participants involved in research. Then the next question is whether you need consent. And if the answer is yes, you do need POPI consent, the question that you need to answer is whether you are being transparent enough, in other words, whether the consent is informed. These requirements are virtually identical to the informed consent requirements for ethics and National Health Act purposes. Then the next set of questions that the code asks you to consider has to do with where the personal information is coming from. So for those of you who are collecting information directly from the data subject or from the research participant, that obviously is allowable. There are a set of questions around if you are reusing information that was previously collected for research purposes. There are a set of questions that determines whether you are allowed to do that without obtaining consent again first. there are rules around when you can collect personal information from sources other than the research participant. So if you are harvesting information, for instance, from the internet or social media or public records. Then comes the part of the code where we assess whether the information that you're collecting is of a high quality. Again, something that should be considered as part of your planning already. Obviously, your research is only as good as your raw data. So one would think that you are already taking into consideration whether the information that you are collecting is adequate, relevant, not excessive, and of a high quality. So is it accurate as well? And then lastly, or the two last things to assess is whether the information that you are using is secure, and I'll take you through what the different the standard is that the code is going to prescribe for information security. And then lastly, can research participants exercise their rights? Again, the main right here is the right to either withdraw consent if you were required to ask consent, or to object to being part of the research. Those are the two most important rights, but research participants also have other rights, such as access to their personal information. It's not an unlimited right. Similarly, they have a right to deletion, but again, that is not an unfettered right. They have to have very good reason, and that is set out in the code. Right, that was the bird's eye view. So the good news is we're through the code once already now. So now I'm just going to revisit some of these issues at a more sort of at a slower pace. So we've gone through it once now already. So first off, the important issue to understand is that we are required by POPI and by the code to follow a way of working that is referred to as privacy by design. What this means is that the code must be considered already when you are planning your research, so before the research commences. And this is done by going through all of these questions that I illustrated in this little flow diagram. And this is referred to as a personal information impact assessment. So there is a risk assessment to first identify which projects are high impact, but then there is a personal information impact assessment, which takes you through all of those questions that I breezed through just now. And this should happen before the research commences. Now, I anticipate that many of you are going to ask me, okay, what about research that has already commenced? This is another part of code compliance that UCT will now plan, is what are we going to do about research that has already started and is ongoing? The code and POPI still applies to that research, even though it might have started before POPI came into effect, because there is ongoing processing. For the most part, what we would be concerned about is to ensure that the research data is secure. So what you can likely anticipate is that there will be some form of assessment of existing projects, particularly projects that are high in impact. So that in the initial assessment, risk assessment, comes out as having a high impact on privacy. So there will be some form of assessment. But this still needs to be planned, and obviously we have to take into account what will be the least disruptive method of ensuring code compliance. All of this, as you can probably tell, is an almighty exercise in balancing the very obvious public interest in allowing research to continue versus ensuring that we respect the privacy of research participants. So that means that we, as far as we can, will have a very light touch, particularly on the assumption being true that most research with human participants would already have undergone rigorous research ethics assessments at its inception, which probably translates into about 80% code compliance anyway. Right. So in future, though, these assessments need to happen before the research commences. Right. So this means that POPI and the code will impact how research gets approved. And again, we can't yet give you a definitive answer on exactly the approval process of research at UCT will change, because this is something that we have to plan, and obviously we can only plan that once we know what will be in the code. But because we now have a fairly good indication of what will be in the code, we can start that planning, and we will communicate those changes in due course. But again, the good news is that this is extremely similar to assessing potential harm or risk to research participants, which again, if you are conducting research using human participants, you would have been doing anyway, because you would have gone through the process of ensuring that your research is ethical. Okay. So now I'm going to talk just a little bit more about accountability, and then I'm going to revisit some aspects of the code, and then I'm going to get to all of your questions. So who is accountable? Again, the code and POPI introduces this notion of the responsible party, and for most researchers working at a research institution such as the university, if you are an employee of the university will be accountable for that research, because it is done under the umbrella of the university's policies on research as well as information security. So as long as you are acting within the course and scope of that employment, and as I said, a good test there is the university deducting PAYE tax from your salary. But if you are employed, the university is accountable. But when there is collaboration, in other words, there are other institutions involved. For instance, the research might be externally funded, or there might be other institutions that are collaborating with each other on a single project, or there might be independent researchers, in other words, researchers that are working on not under as an employee of UCT, but perhaps in another capacity. There must be contracts in place that determine who is accountable for what aspects of code compliance. So usually if there is external funding, for instance, or a researcher that isn't employed by the university, so isn't under an employment contract, there normally would already be contracts in place. And we will be working with the Research Contracts Office to ensure that those contracts contain the right provisions to determine or to set out who is responsible for what. Clarity is very important here, but 9 times out of 10, it is the institutions who will either in their own capacity or jointly be responsible for code compliance. Right, so here are some other parts of the code that I think I just wanted to give you just some explanation to guide you during the submission process. And how I picked these is these are the most complex parts of the code. So with the best will in the world, we can't make POPI compliance simple, simply because it is complex. So when we drafted the code, perhaps I can share with you this insight, we took a comparative approach. So POPI is new in some respects. It's now a year old, but in other respects, it's a very old piece of legislation. It was already drafted in 2009. And it took a long time to get approved, and then it took another long time to appoint the information regulator and get ready for POPI's rollout, so to speak. But it is actually based on legislation that has been in place in New Zealand since 1999, and then also in the European Union since the early 2000s. So in a sense, POPI is already in its 20s. And what that did was it allowed us the luxury of being able to look at other research codes in the European Union as well as in other countries in the Commonwealth, because we know that POPI was based on the legislation that had been in place there since the early 2000s and the late 90s. And so we've taken the best of all of the codes that we could find. And we certainly tried to use the most, I don't want to say simple, because again, it's a complex topic. We try to use the clearest ways to express the obligations on researchers and on research institutions. So it is the product of a comparative legal analysis and drafting process that we have followed. Right, but despite our best efforts, I think it's important to acknowledge that complying with POPI and complying with the code is complex, and so I want to just shed some light on some of the more issue-laden, if I can put it like that, topics within the code. So first off is the question of whether you need a POPI consent. Again, I review this as independent of whether you need informed consent, but informed consent and POPI consent are very, very similar. Certainly, I wouldn't wouldn't necessarily have two separate consents. But in terms of POPIA, you don't always need consent. Right. So if you are processing special personal information, so that was the list, including information about race, biometric information, and health information. If the research is in the public interest and it's impossible or would require disproportionate effort to get consent, you don't need consent. Right. So some of you might be in studies where it is impossible to get consent, yet the research is so important that the research must continue. POPIA will not disrupt that. But it has to be assessed very carefully. And again, that research has probably already undergone rigorous ethics review, particularly if it was impossible to obtain consent. But if you are doing research using special personal information without consent and it did not go through a rigorous process of assessing whether it is ethical, you should revisit that. Right. So if you are doing research and there's no special personal information, you're not processing information relating to race or relating to health information or relating to criminal behavior or political or religious views. So let's say there's none of that, there's no special personal information, then you also do not need POPIA consent if the research passes what is called a legitimate interest assessment. Right. So because we are at the university, we would always again consider whether there is a legitimate interest assessment in it or a legitimate interest in the research. Again, this is only if there's no special personal information. And what a legitimate interest assessment is it is identical to the ethical inquiry as to whether the infringement on a research participant's privacy, whether the harm caused by that is outweighed by the value of the research. So again, very similar to current ethical inquiries. So the most important thing though here is that you must have thought about this. If you can get informed consent, do. If you can't, be very, very careful in making sure that these grounds that are listed on this slide applies, and document the assessment that you've done in order to justify that you couldn't or didn't get consent in order to conduct your research. This is likely, again, not to cause too much upheaval in the health sciences or in research that was assessed against the NHREC guidelines, because they are very similar. But for the research involving human participation that didn't undergo sort of that assessment in terms of the NHREC guidelines, and this might be some extra work that you just need to do in order to ensure that your research is justified. Then there is the processing limitation. So that's when we were asking, is the personal information that you're collecting necessary and proportional to the purpose for which you're collecting it? And here are some of the questions that you need to be asking. Do you really need all of the personal information for this research? What personal information is necessary perhaps for future research? So we know sometimes we collect more personal information because we anticipate that it might be valuable in future, and that is still allowable. Why must the personal information be identified for this research? So wherever possible, if there's no earthly reason why you need to be able to identify the individual research participant, the information should be collected anonymously. If there is a good or compelling reason why the personal information can't be collected anonymously, can you mask the identity of the research participants? In other words, can it be pseudonymized? And so again, nothing in the code is about stopping research. Nothing in POPIA, the information regulator itself, has got a very nice way of putting it. It's a very enabling piece of legislation in the sense that it does not prohibit anything, really. It tells you how you must do research using personal information. So it is always about being as safe as possible, as reasonable as possible, infringing research participants' privacy as little as possible, but fully acknowledging that all research using human participation does infringe our privacy to some degree, but because of the social and public good of that is research activity, that infringement of their privacy will often be justifiable. Right, so the process limitation carries on, and we need to look at our melody. if you will be collecting personal information directly from research participants, we have to think about how those research participants are being being recruited. If you are collecting information indirectly, in other words, not from the research participants, but perhaps from an open source or from a public record or from the internet, there are some additional questions that you need to ask in order to assess whether you are justified in collecting that information without consent. For the most part, we realize that getting new consent when you are collecting information, my apologies for that, when you are collecting personal information from a public record or from a repository, or it might not always be possible to go and get a new consent. And so we need to ask ourselves whether we satisfy the requirements when we do not need further informed consent. So if your research does involve harvesting information from sources other than the research participant directly, you need to flag that and make sure that you are justified in sourcing the information from where you are sourcing it, but 9 times out of 10 it will be justified. Then, as I mentioned, this is again things that we should be doing in our research protocols anyway, documenting carefully the purpose of the research, future purposes to which the personal information might be put, that we specify how long the information will be retained, where it will be retained, who will have access to it, if information is going to be de-identified, how, if it's not going to be de-identified, why, and whether there's any risk of re-identification. All of these things should be documented. So you should also read the code with a view of where do we document this. 9 times out of 10, these are things that you're already documenting either in your research protocol or more specifically in your research data management plans. So to a large extent, what the code will force us to do is a little bit of housekeeping, to check our existing processes, our existing templates, etc., and making sure that we are documenting all of these things that the code requires us to document. And then you would have heard me talk a lot about future use or further processing. Sometimes in the research context, this is known as secondary use of research data. It is allowed in terms of POPI because of the public interest in conducting effective research. There should just be safeguards around the information. Again, a reminder, and this is obviously relevant for questions around open access. POPI permits open access. It is a question of whether that information is published in an identifiable form, which in most open access repositories it is not. So if the information is re-identifiable, or if there is information that is connected to biometric information like genetic information, and it is linked, and it is identifiable, you might still be able to have open access to that data as long as there are measures in place to make sure that that data will only be used for research purposes. So for instance, it is behind a DAC, a data access committee, and that you ensure that the information will not be published in an identifiable form, which is often a requirement in terms for using information in open access repositories. So again, there's a balancing of the right to privacy with the interest of society in allowing research activities to continue, and all the code requires is that there are satisfactory safeguards in place to ensure that that information is only put out there under controlled circumstances in order so that it isn't simply published for all the world to see and to use for unrestricted purposes. But then we need to think about information quality, which hopefully we are already doing, because again, this is a key part of your research design. If the information that you are basing your findings on is inaccurate, your research will be flawed. So none of this, I think, is new. But POPI also requires it, that we look at whether our information is coming from reliable sources, whether we're doing data quality reviews, whether we are allowing access to research participants. Again, this is not an unfettered requirement, but it is a good way of ensuring that information the accuracy is maintained, that we're doing master data management. In other words, that there is one set of data and we know which is the valid set. We're not creating thousands of different versions. So these are all questions, again, that should be part of your research design process. It should already be documented in your research protocols, because it speaks directly to the quality of your research. But the code it codifies it. That we should be asking these questions when we are using identifiable personal information in research activities. Then security safeguards. This is where we anticipate most of the changes will have to happen. That is just from what we know about research institutions. So what the code does is it follows a risk-based approach. So you remember that impact assessment, the 10-question impact assessment. This is where it gets really relevant. So if you are conducting high impact research, in other words, you've answered yes to more than 5 of those 10 questions, what it means is that the Deputy Information Officer of the university, or someone or someone's to whom they have delegated that responsibility, and we don't know who those someones will be yet. We're going to have to design this process and make sure that it works and is efficient. We'll have to sign off on your research data management plan that there are adequate safeguards in place. Right. So what are the safeguards that the code requires? So again, it's not a flat requirement. It depends on, well, all research should be done in a secure way. Whether it's going to be signed off formally will depend on that impact assessment. But we have to look at whether access to your research data is controlled. In other words, can anybody access it, or is that access limited to authorized people? And do we log access? In other words, do we know who has accessed the data? If you have to share that information with third parties, let's say you're using different service providers or you are collaborating, are they also complying with the code's security safeguards so that information continues to be protected? Are you using acceptable software when you process identifiable personal information? So is that software university sanctioned? Is the information being stored in a secure location? This might be a physical location or a digital location, but that goes along with using acceptable software. If, for instance, you're using cloud services in order to store your data, are you transferring the personal information or communicating the personal information out, in which case the security of your transfer methods or communication methods is relevant? Are you using mobile devices or working remotely or using removable hardware in order to store the information? And are those devices secure? If the information is being stored in a physical format, the code also has a section on physical security. Then there's a section on creating reliable backups, because POPI doesn't only care about the safety of the information from a security standpoint, it also cares about the preservation of the information. We don't want it to accidentally be lost. We want there to be backups. And then there is a section on the code relating to pseudonymization and anonymization. As I said earlier, if anonymization is feasible, it should be done. If pseudonymization is feasible, it should be done. And encryption. When you are conducting high impact research, encryption should be considered very, very strongly. And if encryption is not possible, we should document why it is not possible. Even if that reason is the institution does not currently have the technology available, but it has to be considered, and it has to be documented that we considered it, right? So the code contains provisions on all of these security measures, and one of the tasks that we will have now that the code is out, is to assess as an institution, not just as individual researchers, but as an institution, to what extent we have infrastructure available to support researchers in ensuring that they can safeguard their information. So there's not just work for individual researchers to do here, but also work for the institution to figure out whether policies need to be adjusted and what infrastructure is available to enable secure research. Lastly, if your research data is going to go to other countries, and sharing here might take 2 forms. It could be that we're transmitting it to another country for processing there, or we might be giving access to researchers who are located in other countries. Because there's then collaboration outside of UCT, there needs to be a contract in place. but B, we ensure that there is adequate protection of the information. That can take one of two forms principally. The first one is it might be a country where there is already adequate laws protecting the information. Any EU countries or countries that have passed an adequacy assessment by the European Commission will be considered adequate. But if there isn't adequate legislation in place, so for instance, like in the US, then the safeguards need to be documented in the contract. So contracts become very, very important here. We might not just be sharing information for collaboration purposes. We might also be sharing information with service providers who are either storing the information for us or providing laboratory services. The same rules would apply. We need to make sure that we've got adequate contracts in place that ensure that the personal information will be safeguarded. And that is what I wanted to get through today. We are going to answer your questions now, and after that I'm going to hand back to Lynn for some instructions on how you can make submissions on the code, because it is important that we make submissions, that we indicate to ASSAf where we feel the code might be impractical. Just a reminder that the code cannot be any less protective than POPI itself. So many of these things are required by the legislation itself, in which case the code has to address them. But things like the security safeguards, that standard, the practical standard that is prescribed there, are very much up for debate, and I do want UCT to participate in that debate. Lynn, I don't know if you want to talk about how submissions must be made before we get to the questions.
Yes, we can do that. Sorry,
let's do that.
Challenging. Yes, there's one. Yeah, I think so. So we thought our timeline is tight to submit. The deadline is only the 14th of October, which is about 2.5 weeks away. And so we did think that it would be a good idea to collate submissions from UCT. I will send out a notice with the code attached and with a request for submissions. I'll do it via the deans of the various faculties, and then collate submissions so that we can actually send a document to ASSAf via email. They have a form, but that form is going to be quite difficult because it's only one comment at a time. And it's going to mean you're going to be doing, if you want to comment on various sections, you're going to be having to do multiple forms. So I think it's best that we collate and submit as UCT. But obviously that doesn't completely prevent people from doing other things. But and it can be sent to my email address. Thanks, Elizabeth. I'll hand back to you for questions.
Right. I'm sure there are some. Ronica, are you going to moderate for me, or?
We don't have any questions that have come through yet, so we can give it a minute or two.
Can I just
Lynn,
confirm?
Yes, do you have questions, Lynn? You and I might as well preempt some.
This session, was it recorded, and will we be able to post it?
Yes.
I think might have not had a great attendance because it was advertised and the code only came out on Friday. So it would be a good idea if we can actually at least post the session for people if they want to,
yes.
If they want to do it. Yeah.
So we have a dedicated team site where we post all of the POPI related questions and answers and videos and things. I mean, Ronica, I'm sure we can do the same with this session.
Yes, we will do so.
Okay.
Can I ask a question around the responsible party, particularly when one is collaborating with researchers that are not in South Africa?
Yes.
How are researchers going to navigate that?
So I think the important thing to say is, I mean, when there's collaboration like that, I mean, there is very often already a contract in place that will address things like data management.
Yes.
So I that is the best. It almost becomes less important, you know, legally who is accountable, as long as the contract is clear. Very often another sort of rule of thumb that you can use is not only will it mostly be the institution, because there is a employment relationship with the researcher, but very, very often the primary responsibility will lie with the institution that gave approval to that research, ethics approval.
Yeah.
Yeah. So think about it in terms of control. The institution that controls what should be, you know, how the research should be done, whose policies are in place, etc., will ordinarily be accountable for POPIA compliance, or the university or institution that approved the research will often be accountable. So it's very, but the contract is very important. It should be spelled out.
Okay. Great. Thanks for that.
Yes, I think it is a plausible explanation that there are also people who are having load shedding and probably difficulty posting questions. So what I'm going to suggest is, if there are any questions, and they might come up later as you grapple with the code, please do not hesitate to ask them. So whether you submit your questions along with your submissions to Lynn, or whether you want to use the poppy@uct.ac.za email address, that is popia, POPIA @uct.ac.za. We are here, the team is here to answer your questions. I think it is extremely likely that we will, if not now, in future, be posting or creating various FAQs and guidance documents to help researchers navigate the code. So your questions help us to understand which aspects of it you find challenging. So please don't hesitate to send any questions that you might have through to either Lynn or to popia@uct.ac.za, and we will make sure that those questions get answered. Lynn, do you have any more questions?
No more questions from my side, thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, then we're going to give everybody the gift of time, which is no small gift these days.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for this.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.